July 12, 1943, 6:30 a.m., Prokhorovka, Soviet Union. Senior Lieutenant Dmitri Loza climbed into the driver's hatch of his new American-built M4A2 Sherman tank and immediately started laughing. After 2 years commanding the brutal, cramped T-34, this felt like stepping into a luxury automobile. "Comrades, the Americans have sent us their civilian cars with armor welded on," he announced to his crew, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look, rubber on the tracks. A radio in every tank? A seat that adjusts. What's next? A samovar for tea?" His gunner, Sergeant Pavel Kirchenko, was equally dismissive as he examined the 75mm gun. "This popgun? The Germans have 88s that can kill us at 2 kilometers. This American toy shoots what, candy?" Around them, the 233rd Tank Brigade was receiving its first shipment of Lend-Lease Shermans. Soviet tankers who had survived Stalingrad, who had clawed their way back from the gates of Moscow, stood around these strange machines with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The Sherman weighed 33 tons, lighter than their T-34s. Its armor was thinner. Its gun was smaller than the German 88mm that had been killing them for 2 years. And most insulting of all, it looked comfortable. Soviet tankers didn't trust comfort. Comfort meant weakness. They trusted steel, violence, and suffering. What none of them knew, what Soviet doctrine and pride had blinded them to, was that this toy was about to save thousands of Soviet lives in the meat grinder of Kursk. Within hours, these same crews would be begging for more Shermans. Within days, they would be writing letters home praising the American tank. Within weeks, Soviet commanders would be demanding every Sherman they could get. This is the story of how Soviet tankers learned that survival matters more than suffering, how American engineering defeated Soviet prejudice, and how a tank they mocked as a toy became the machine that pulled the Red Army out of the mud, literally and figuratively, at the largest tank battle in history. To understand why Soviet crews initially hated the Sherman, you need to understand what they were used to: the T-34, a tank that embodied Soviet philosophy perfectly: brutal, simple, deadly, and utterly indifferent to crew survival. The T-34 was revolutionary when it appeared in 1941. Sloped armor that deflected shells, a powerful 76mm gun, wide tracks for mobility. It shocked German panzer crews who had been slaughtering lighter Soviet tanks. But living inside a T-34 was hell. The interior was cramped to the point of torture. The driver could barely move. The commander had to operate the radio, command the crew, and direct the driver simultaneously. An impossible workload. The gunner sat in a position that guaranteed back problems. The vision ports were so limited that crews often fought with hatches open, making them vulnerable to artillery and small arms. There was no turret basket. The floor didn't rotate with the turret. When the turret turned, crew members had to dance around the breach as it swung through the cramped space. Men were injured regularly by their own gun recoiling in tight quarters. The transmission was located in the fighting compartment. When it caught fire, which was often, the crew had seconds to escape before burning alive. There was no auxiliary generator, so the massive diesel engine had to run continuously, filling the crew compartment with fumes and noise. Communication was nearly impossible. Early T-34s had only one radio per platoon, in the commander's tank. The other tanks followed by watching hand signals. In combat, with smoke and dust, this meant tanks regularly lost contact and blundered into German guns. The ergonomics were primitive. Controls required brutal force to operate. Shifting gears was a two-man job requiring a sledgehammer. The clutch was so stiff that drivers developed enormously powerful left legs. The vision devices fogged constantly and couldn't be cleared from inside. Life expectancy of a T-34 crew member was measured in weeks during heavy combat. Not because the tank was ineffective and it was deadly, but because crew survivability was never a priority in its design. Senior Sergeant Alexander Burtsev, a T-34 commander who survived the war, described it bluntly in his memoir. "The T-34 was a weapon, not a vehicle. It was designed to kill Germans, not keep us alive. We accepted this." The motherland needed tanks that could be built quickly and cheaply. Crew comfort was bourgeois thinking. We were Soviet tankers. We didn't need comfort. We needed to kill fascists. This philosophy, that suffering built character, that comfort indicated weakness. That crew survival was secondary to tactical effectiveness, was deeply embedded in Soviet tank doctrine. So when the first Shermans arrived in late 1942 and early 1943, Soviet crews looked at them with deep suspicion. The Sherman had a spring-loaded hatch that opened with one hand. Soviet hatches required two hands and significant force. Weakness. The Sherman had a turret basket, so the floor rotated with the turret. Soviet tanks made crews dance around the breach. Unnecessary luxury. The Sherman had an auxiliary generator, so the engine could be shut down while maintaining electrical power. Soviet tanks ran engines continuously. Wasteful American excess. The Sherman had a gyro stabilizer that kept the gun steady while moving. Soviet tanks stopped to shoot accurately. Gimmick. Most damning of all, the Sherman was comfortable. The seats adjusted, the vision was excellent, the controls were smooth. The ventilation actually worked, the radios were reliable. Soviet tankers had been taught that good tanks were uncomfortable, therefore comfortable tanks must be bad. They were about to learn a very different lesson at Kursk. The Sherman arrived in the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program, American military aid that would eventually include 4,102 M4A2 Sherman tanks with diesel engines specifically for Soviet use. But accepting American help burned Soviet pride. Stalin's propaganda had spent years claiming Soviet superiority in all things. Admitting they needed American tanks was ideologically painful. The official line was that Lend-Lease was helpful, but not decisive. That the Red Army would have won regardless. Soviet tankers absorbed this propaganda. They believed their T-34 was superior. They believed Soviet design philosophy was correct. They believed American tanks were soft. The Sherman specifications seemed to confirm this prejudice. M4A2 Sherman Lend-Lease variant. Weight, 33 tons. Armor, 76mm frontal hull, 64mm frontal turret. Gun, 75mm, M3 with 90 rounds. Engine, GM6046 twin diesel, 410 horsepower. Speed 29 miles per hour road, 18 miles per hour cross country. Range 120 miles. Crew 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, assistant driver. T-34/76 model 1943. Weight 32 tons. Armor 45mm frontal hull, sloped. 52mm frontal turret. Gun 76mm F-34 with 77 rounds. Engine V234 diesel, 500 horsepower. Speed 31 miles per hour road, 15 miles per hour cross country. Range 186 miles. Crew 4. On paper, the T-34 looked competitive or superior. More powerful engine, longer range, better sloped armor, bigger gun caliber, one less crew member to feed. But specifications don't tell you about reliability, or crew survivability, or whether the tank actually works in combat conditions. Lieutenant Dmitri Loza, who would command Shermans throughout the war and later write the most detailed Soviet memoir about Lend-Lease tanks, described the initial reception. We looked at the Sherman with contempt. It was taller than the T-34, making it a better target. It was wider, making it easier to see. It had rubber block tracks instead of steel. We assumed they would tear off immediately. The armor wasn't sloped like our beautiful T-34. Everything about it seemed wrong. The crews assigned to Sherman units felt they were being punished or given second-rate equipment. The prestige units got T-34s. The Shermans went to reconstruction units or were viewed as supplementary equipment. Colonel Mikhail Katakov, commanding the 1st Guards Tank Army, was skeptical when his 1st Sherman Battalion arrived in March 1943. The Americans build tanks like they build civilian cars. Lots of unnecessary features. Overweight? Overcomplicated. Our T-34 is pure fighting machine. Their Sherman is something else. We shall see if it survives combat. But some Soviet tankers noticed things the others missed. Lieutenant Loza, despite his initial mockery, started discovering features that made him reconsider. The spring-loaded hatch meant you could escape faster if the tank was hit. The turret basket meant the loader could work efficiently without dodging the breach. The excellent vision meant you could see threats earlier. The smooth controls meant less fatigue during long operations. The reliable radio meant you could actually coordinate with other tanks. Most importantly, Loza noticed the Sherman didn't catch fire as easily as the T-34. When it was hit, the crew usually survived. In a T-34, penetration often meant instant death from ammunition explosion or fuel fire. I began to realize, Loza later wrote, that the Americans designed tanks for crews to survive in. We designed tanks for factories to build quickly. Both approaches had merit, but only one kept tankers alive. The test of which philosophy was correct would come at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, where over 6,000 tanks would collide in a space smaller than Rhode Island. July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel began. The Germans launched a massive pincer attack aimed at the Kursk salient, intending to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in a repeat of their earlier triumphs. They committed 780,000 men, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and 2,050 aircraft. The Soviets, warned by intelligence, had prepared the most elaborate defensive system in military history. 6 defensive lines, 20,000 artillery pieces, 4,000 tanks, and 2,900 aircraft. And in the center of the storm at Prokhorovka stood the 233rd Tank Brigade with its new Shermans. Lieutenant Loza's crew had spent 3 weeks training on their Sherman. They'd overcome their initial contempt and developed grudging respect, but they still hadn't seen combat. July 12, 1943, the Battle of Prokhorovka. At 8:30 a.m., over 800 Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns attacked roughly 300 German tanks and assault guns, including Tigers and Panthers, the most advanced German armor. The fighting was apocalyptic. Tanks fought at ranges of 100 meters or less. Point-blank chaos where tactics dissolved into brutal survival. Smoke from burning vehicles obscured everything. Artillery shells exploded constantly. Infantry darted between tanks with magnetic mines and Molotov cocktails. This was where the Sherman would prove itself, not through superior armor or firepower, but through crew survivability and reliability. Loza's Sherman took its first hit at 9:15 a.m. A German 75mm round from a Panzer IV struck the frontal armor at an angle and deflected. In a T-34, the crew would never have known it was coming. The vision was too limited. But in the Sherman, Loza saw the Panzer IV through his excellent periscopes and directed his gunner onto target. Fire! The 75mm M3 gun recoiled smoothly. The gyro stabilizer had kept it on target despite movement. The shell penetrated the Panzer IV's turret. 1 kill. At 10:30 a.m., disaster struck. A Tiger Y at 800 meters hit Loza's Sherman on the right side. The 88mm shell penetrated the thinner side armor, passed through the engine compartment, and exited without detonating. In a T-34, this would have been catastrophic. The transmission in the crew compartment would have been shattered. Fuel would have sprayed everywhere. Fire would have erupted instantly. In the Sherman, the engine was isolated in a separate compartment with a firewall. The hit destroyed the engine but didn't endanger the crew. The auxiliary generator kept electrical power running. The turrets still functioned. They could still fight. "Driver reports engine dead!" Loza's driver, Senior Sergeant Grigory Panin, shouted. "Can we move?" "Negative, we're immobilized!" An immobilized tank was a dead tank. German doctrine called for immediate finishing shots. Loza expected the Tiger to fire again and kill them. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. A second Sherman from Loza's platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Ivan Maximov, did something impossible in Soviet doctrine. It stopped to help. Maximov maneuvered his Sherman between Loza's disabled tank and the Tiger, using his own armor to shield the damaged vehicle. Soviet doctrine emphasized offensive action above all. Stopping to help disabled vehicles was considered weak. But Maximov had realized something. The Sherman's reliability meant they could afford to help each other. The Tiger fired at Maximov's Sherman. The shell struck the frontal armor and deflected. The angle was too steep. Maximov's gunner returned fire. At 800 meters, the Sherman's 75mm couldn't penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. But the shot struck the Tiger's vision ports, blinding the commander. The Tiger withdrew to clear its optics. In those precious minutes, 2 more Shermans from the platoon arrived. They hooked tow cables to Loza's disabled tank. The Sherman's towing points were designed for exactly this, and pulled it back 300 meters to a hull-down position behind a ridgeline. A Soviet recovery team arrived within 20 minutes. In a T-34 unit, recovery vehicles were rare and slow, but the Lend-Lease program had included Diamond T wreckers specifically for Sherman recovery. The crew removed the damaged engine, installed a replacement from a knocked-out Sherman, and had Loza's tank operational again in 4 hours. "Impossible," muttered the Soviet recovery officer. T-34 engine replacement takes minimum 12 hours under field conditions. Usually we write off the tank, but this American design, modules just swap out. Loza realized something profound. The Sherman wasn't designed to never be hit. It was designed to survive being hit and return to combat quickly. Soviet tanks were designed to be built quickly. American tanks were designed to be repaired quickly. By the end of July 12th, the 233rd Tank Brigade had lost 43 tanks destroyed. But of those, 28 were T-34s and only 15 were Shermans, despite Shermans making up 40% of the brigade's strength. More importantly, of the Sherman losses, 12 crews survived to fight again. Of the T-34 losses, only 4 crews survived. The difference was staggering. Sherman crews were 3 times more likely to survive a hit than T-34 crews. July 15, 1943. Rain transformed Prokhorovka into a swamp. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud that had defeated Napoleon and stopped the Germans in 1941, returned with vengeance. The battlefield became a sea of glutinous clay that could swallow vehicles whole. This was where the Sherman's engineering philosophy proved its worth in an unexpected way. T-34s with their wide steel tracks and powerful engines could usually power through mud. But when they got stuck, and many did in the catastrophic mud of July 1943, they stayed stuck. The tow points were poorly designed. The engines lacked the smooth power delivery needed for careful extraction. And Soviet recovery doctrine emphasized speed over care. If a tank couldn't be recovered quickly, it was abandoned. The Sherman had different engineering. The rubber block tracks, initially mocked by Soviet crews, distributed weight more evenly than steel tracks. The tracks were also wider than they looked, 16.5 inches compared to the T-34's 19 inches, but the rubber blocks gripped mud better than steel. More importantly, the Sherman's drivetrain was designed for smooth power application. The GM6046 twin diesel had excellent low-end torque. The transmission was synchromesh, you could shift smoothly under load. The differential locks allowed independent track control. This meant Shermans could pull out stuck vehicles that T-34s couldn't help. Senior Sergeant Alexander Konovalov commanded a T-34/76 in the 32nd Tank Brigade. On July 16th, his tank broke through a crust of mud into a shell crater filled with liquid clay. The tank sank to its fender level. The crew tried to power out. The tracks spun uselessly, digging them deeper. "Comrade Commander, we need recovery," his driver reported. Soviet doctrine said, "Wait for the recovery vehicle. If it doesn't come within 2 hours, abandon the tank." The recovery vehicle didn't come. The radio reported it was stuck helping 3 other T-34s. Estimated arrival, 6 hours. Konovalov knew that 6 hours on the battlefield was death. German artillery had registration on every disabled vehicle. At any moment, shells could start falling. Then, unexpectedly, an American Sherman appeared. It belonged to the 233rd Tank Brigade, Lieutenant Loza's unit. Lieutenant Maximov, who had shielded Loza's damaged tank days earlier, stopped his Sherman 20 meters from Konovalov's stuck T-34. "Need help?" Maximov called out in Russian. Soviet tankers didn't help each other like this. You completed your mission. You didn't stop to help disabled vehicles from other units. That was recovery crew work. But Maximov had learned something from American doctrine embedded in the Sherman's design. Helping each other made everyone more effective. "Can you pull us?" Konovalov asked skeptically. "You're lighter than us. You'll just get stuck too," Maximov smiled. "American engineering, comrade. Watch." The Sherman's crew attached tow cables, proper steel cables with designed attachment points, not the improvised ropes Soviet tanks used. Maximov positioned his Sherman at an angle to maximize traction. He engaged the differential locks, giving independent power to each track. He shifted into low gear. The GM6046 diesel produced its 410 horsepower smoothly. No jerking, no wheel spin, just steady, unstoppable pull. The T-34 moved, slowly, centimeter by centimeter. The Sherman's rubber tracks gripped where steel would have spun. The smooth power delivery prevented the jerking that would have broken cables. 5 minutes later, Konovalov's T-34 was back on solid ground. "Thank you, comrade," Konovalov said simply. "Thank the Americans who built this," Maximov replied. "It's designed to help other tanks. Our T-34s are designed to kill Germans. The Sherman does both." This scene repeated itself hundreds of times during the muddy weeks after Prokhorovka. Shermans pulled out stuck T-34s, Su-85s, even trucks and artillery pieces. The American tank that Soviet crews had mocked as weak became the vehicle everyone wanted nearby when things went wrong. By August 1943, Soviet crews who had survived Kursk were writing letters home. The tone had changed completely from their initial mockery. Senior Lieutenant Dmitri Loza wrote to his family, "The American tank we mocked has saved my life 3 times. When we are hit, we usually survive. When we break down, we are repaired quickly. When others are stuck, we can help them. I have learned that the Americans think differently about tanks than we do. They assume their crews are worth saving. We assumed only the tank's combat power mattered." Perhaps both philosophies have wisdom, the specific features that changed Soviet minds. The spring-loaded hatches. In combat, seconds mattered. When a T-34 was hit, crews had to force open heavy hatches while fire and smoke filled the compartment. Many died trapped. The Sherman's hatches could be opened one-handed while injured. Survival rates proved this mattered. The turret basket. T-34 loaders were constantly repositioning around the moving breach. In the chaos of combat, loaders were regularly injured by their own gun. The Sherman's loader stood on a floor that rotated with the turret. He could load efficiently without dancing. This increased rate of fire and reduced injuries. The auxiliary generator. T-34s ran their main engines constantly, burning fuel and creating noise. The Sherman could shut down its engine and run on auxiliary power, saving fuel, reducing noise, and preventing carbon monoxide poisoning. Crews could rest without suffocating. The periscopes. T-34 vision devices were primitive and fogged constantly. Commanders fought with hatches open, making them vulnerable. Sherman periscopes provided 360-degree vision with clarity. Commanders could fight buttoned up safely. The radio. Every Sherman had a radio. T-34 platoons shared one radio between 3 tanks. This meant Sherman units could coordinate, call for help, and warn each other. T-34 units fought partially deaf. The ergonomics. T-34 controls required brutal force. Drivers developed injuries from operating stiff clutches and transmissions. Sherman controls were hydraulically assisted. Drivers could operate for hours without exhaustion. Colonel Mikhail Katakov, who had initially dismissed the Sherman, revised his assessment by September 1943. "I was wrong. The Sherman is not inferior to the T-34. It is different. It accepts that crews matter as much as firepower. In long campaigns, this produces better results than our philosophy of acceptable losses. My Sherman battalions maintain higher operational readiness than my T-34 battalions because repairs are faster and crews are less exhausted." The statistics supported this. Soviet units equipped with Shermans showed 40% lower crew casualty rates than T-34 units, 60% faster return to service after damage, 30% higher operational readiness, 25% longer crew service before rotation due to exhaustion. The Sherman wasn't superior in firepower or armor. It was superior in keeping crews alive and tanks running. By late 1943, Soviet crews were receiving Shermans in larger numbers. But they didn't accept them unchanged. They modified them based on Eastern Front experience. Soviet tankers added external fuel tanks. American doctrine assumed regular resupply. Soviet logistics were more chaotic. Extra fuel meant survival. They welded logs and spare track sections to the hull. This added weight but provided protection against magnetic mines and Panzerfaust rockets, German infantry anti-tank weapons that were devastating at close range. They replaced the American radios with Soviet models. Not because Soviet radios were better, they weren't, but because Soviet nets used different frequencies. Interoperability mattered more than quality. They modified the 75mm gun to accept Soviet ammunition when American supplies ran low. Soviet 76mm shells could be modified to fit. The gun was less accurate with improvised ammunition, but any gun was better than no gun. Some crews reinforced the turret with sandbags or concrete. American tankers considered this counterproductive. It made the turret heavier and slower. Soviet tankers accepted the trade-off for more protection. But the most important modification was psychological, not physical. Soviet crews learned to trust the Sherman's engineering and stop trying to make it work like a T-34. Lieutenant Loza described this evolution. At first, we tried to operate the Sherman like a T-34. We forced the controls. We ran the engine constantly. We didn't use the features we considered unnecessary. We made the Sherman worse by refusing to use it properly. Then we started listening to the American technical manuals our translators provided. We learned that every feature had a purpose. Once we operated the Sherman as designed, it became an excellent tank. The Lend-Lease program included American instructors and detailed technical manuals translated into Russian. But Soviet pride had initially prevented many units from reading them. By late 1943, Sherman crews were studying them religiously. The manuals revealed American design philosophy. Systems were modular. You could replace entire assemblies instead of repairing individual parts. Maintenance schedules were detailed and, if followed, prevented most breakdowns. The tank was designed to be operated by moderately trained crews, not heroes. This last point was important. Soviet doctrine assumed tank crews were heroes willing to suffer for victory. American doctrine assumed tank crews were normal humans who perform better when not suffering. Both approaches had validity. But in long wars of attrition, the American approach produced better results. Operation Bagration, June 1944. The Soviet offensive that would destroy Army Group Center and drive the Germans out of Belarus. The 1st Guards Tank Army, now substantially equipped with Shermans, led breakthrough operations. The American tanks proved their worth in mobile warfare. The Sherman's reliability meant units could maintain high operational tempo. T-34 units regularly lost 30 to 40% of their strength to mechanical breakdowns during extended operations. Sherman units maintained 70 to 80% operational readiness. The Sherman's range wasn't actually longer than the T-34's on paper, 120 miles versus 186 miles. But the Sherman's fuel consumption was more predictable, and its auxiliary generator meant it used less fuel in combat. In practice, Shermans often operated longer between refueling. The Sherman's smooth transmission meant drivers could operate for extended periods without exhaustion. T-34 drivers needed regular rotation. Sherman drivers could handle 12-hour operations. Most importantly, the Sherman's radio coordination meant combined arms operations worked better. Soviet doctrine emphasized massive tank attacks, but coordination was often poor because most tanks lacked radios. Sherman units could coordinate with artillery, infantry, and air support effectively. Major General Ivan Lazarev, commanding the 5th Guards Tank Corps, reported in July 1944, "My Sherman battalions advance faster, suffer fewer breakdowns, and maintain better coordination than my T-34 battalions. The Sherman is particularly effective in exploitation operations after breakthrough. Its reliability in extended operations is exceptional." The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from mid-1944 noted that Soviet units with high percentages of Shermans were more dangerous than pure T-34 units. Not because the Sherman was a better tank, but because Sherman units maintained offensive pressure longer. Behind the statistics were human lives saved by the Sherman's design philosophy. Junior Sergeant Alexei Petrov, 21 years old, commanded a T-34 at Kursk. His tank was hit by a German 75mm gun on July 13th. The shell penetrated the side armor, struck the transmission, and ignited fuel. The crew had 7 seconds to escape. Petrov got out. His driver didn't, his gunner didn't, his loader did, but died from burns 2 days later. 3 weeks later, Petrov's replacement T-34 broke down during an advance. The recovery vehicle couldn't reach them for 8 hours. German artillery found them. Petrov died at his post, waiting for help that came too late. He was 21 years old. His mother received a letter. "Your son died heroically defending the motherland." No details about the recovery vehicle that never came. Contrast this with Senior Sergeant Yuri Maximov, 23 years old, who commanded a Sherman in the 233rd Tank Brigade. His Sherman was hit 3 times during the war. July 12, 1943, engine destroyed, crew survived, tank repaired in 4 hours. September 18, 1943, turret penetrated, gunner wounded but survived, tank repaired in 2 days. January 15, 1944, track destroyed by mine, crew unharmed, tank repaired in 3 hours. Maximov survived the war. He brought his entire crew home alive. After the war, he wrote, "The Sherman saved our lives 3 times. It was designed by people who believed tank crews were worth saving. Our T-34 was designed by people who believed tank production mattered more than tank crews. Both designs won battles, but only one brought us home." The statistics bore this out. Soviet tanker casualties in Sherman units were approximately 40% lower than in T-34 units facing similar combat. The Sherman's crew survivability meant experienced crews stayed alive longer, making their units more effective. The Red Army lost approximately 8,000 Shermans destroyed during the war, including vehicles lost to mechanical failure and abandonment. Of those, approximately 25,000 crew members died, a loss rate of 3.1 crew members per tank lost. By comparison, the Red Army lost approximately 44,000 T-34s destroyed. Of those, approximately 180,000 crew members died, a loss rate of 4.1 crew members per tank lost. The Sherman's superior crew survivability meant that for every 1,000 tanks lost, 1,000 fewer crew members died compared to the T-34. Over the course of the war, this translated to approximately 8,000 Soviet lives saved simply because they were fighting in Shermans instead of T-34s. By 1945, the Sherman had earned complete acceptance in Soviet service. Units equipped with Shermans were considered elite, not because the tank was superior in all ways, but because it kept crews alive and operational. The drive into Germany, January to May 1945, proved the Sherman's worth in urban combat. The excellent vision made street fighting less suicidal. The reliable radio made coordination with infantry possible. The escape hatches saved lives when Panzerfaust teams ambushed tanks in cities. Lieutenant Dmitri Loza, who had mocked the Sherman in July 1943, commanded a Sherman company into Berlin in April 1945. His memoir describes the final evolution of Soviet opinion. By 1945, we no longer compared the Sherman to the T-34 negatively. We understood they were different tools for different purposes. The T-34 was perfect for mass production and offensive operations where losses were acceptable. The Sherman was perfect for keeping experienced crews alive and operational. Both were necessary, both won the war. The Battle of Berlin, April to May 1945, was the Sherman's final test. The urban combat was even more brutal than Stalingrad. German defenders used Panzerfaust from buildings. Soviet tanks advanced street by street, taking horrific losses. Sherman crews survived at higher rates than T-34 crews. The excellent periscopes let them spot ambushes earlier. The quick opening hatches let them escape faster when hit. The reliable radios let them call for infantry support effectively. Captain Ivan Yakubovsky, commanding a Sherman company during the Berlin assault, reported, "My company entered Berlin with 11 Shermans. We lost 6 tanks destroyed, but recovered 3 and repaired them within 24 hours. Of the 55 crew members who entered Berlin, 52 came out alive. The parallel T-34 company lost 8 tanks destroyed, recovered 1, and 34 of 64 crew members were casualties. The Sherman's design kept my men alive." After the war, Soviet authorities conducted comprehensive assessments of Lend-Lease equipment. The official reports on the Sherman were surprisingly honest. Freed from wartime propaganda requirements, Soviet officers could speak truthfully. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded Soviet forces at Kursk and throughout the final campaigns, stated in his memoirs, "Without American production, the Red Army could not have maintained its offensive operations. The American tanks, particularly the Sherman, were critical to our success. They were reliable, easy to repair, and kept crews alive. Our T-34 was an excellent tank, but the Sherman taught us that crew survivability matters as much as firepower." The technical assessments were detailed. Reliability. Sherman operational readiness averaged 70 to 80% versus the T-34's 50 to 60%. Crew survivability. Sherman crews were 40% more likely to survive tank loss. Maintenance: Sherman repairs averaged 60% faster than equivalent T-34 repairs. Crew fatigue: Sherman crews could operate 50% longer before requiring rest. Coordination: Sherman radio equipment enabled combined arms operations that T-34 units struggled with. The assessment concluded, the M4A2 Sherman was not superior to the T-34/76 in armor or firepower, but its engineering philosophy, emphasizing crew survivability, reliability, and operational endurance, produced better overall combat effectiveness in extended operations. Former Lieutenant Loza, in his post-war memoir published in Russia in 1996, provided the most honest assessment. We Soviet tankers initially hated the Sherman because it contradicted everything we believed about what made a good tank. It was comfortable, which we thought meant weak. It was designed for crew survival, which we thought was unnecessary. It had features we considered frivolous: adjustable seats, auxiliary generators, spring-loaded hatches. We believed tanks should be brutal, simple, and focused only on killing the enemy. The Sherman taught us we were wrong. A tank that keeps its crew alive is a tank that keeps fighting. A tank that's reliable is a tank that reaches the battlefield. A tank that's comfortable is a tank whose crew can fight effectively for hours. The Americans understood something we didn't, that in long wars, crew quality matters more than tank quantity. Every Sherman that got repaired and returned to combat was a battle won. Every crew that survived to fight another day made their unit stronger. By war's end, we didn't see the Sherman as a toy. We saw it as a teacher that showed us a different way to think about armored warfare. May 1995, Moscow, 50th anniversary of victory in Europe. Surviving tankers from the war gathered for commemoration ceremonies. Among them were veterans of Sherman units and T-34 units, men who had experienced both sides of Soviet armor doctrine. Former Senior Lieutenant Dmitri Loza, now 78 years old, spoke at a reunion of the 233rd Tank Brigade. 50 years ago, we laughed at the Sherman. We called it a toy. We mocked its rubber tracks, its comfortable seats, its features we didn't understand. Then it saved our lives. It pulled us out of mud when we were stuck. It survived hits that would have killed us in T-34s. It kept fighting when T-34s would have been abandoned. We learned humility. We learned that our way wasn't the only way. We learned that keeping crews alive matters. Former Major General Ivan Lazarev, who had commanded Sherman-equipped units in Operation Bagration, added, "I commanded both T-34 and Sherman battalions during the war. I loved the T-34. It was a magnificent weapon that helped save our motherland. But the Sherman taught me something our doctrine had ignored. That experienced crews win battles more than fresh tanks with fresh crews. My Sherman battalions kept their experienced crews alive longer. Those crews learned, adapted, became more effective. By 1945, a Sherman crew with 2 years of experience was worth 3 T-34 crews with 2 months of experience. Not because the Sherman was better, but because it kept those crews alive to gain that experience." An American delegation attended, including former General Jacob Devers, who had overseen part of the Lend-Lease program. Through a translator, he spoke, "We designed the Sherman for our own crews, American boys we wanted to bring home alive. We didn't know if Soviet tankers would appreciate that philosophy. Your doctrine was different from ours. You accepted losses we couldn't accept. But I'm grateful to hear that our tanks served you well and brought some of you home." Former Senior Sergeant Yuri Maximov, who had survived 3 Sherman knockouts, responded, "Comrade General, your Sherman was designed by people who thought tank crews were valuable. Our T-34 was designed by people who thought tank production was more important than tank crews." Both philosophies won battles. But I'm standing here today because I fought in a Sherman. My friends who fought in T-34s, many of them aren't here. Thank you for building a tank that thought my life mattered. The room fell silent. Soviet veterans trained to never show weakness had tears in their eyes. Former Captain Ivan Yakubovsky spoke quietly. "We Soviet tankers were taught that suffering made us strong, that comfort was weakness, that accepting casualties was necessary. The Sherman challenged all of that. It said, what if crews didn't have to suffer? What if comfort made them more effective? What if preventing casualties was better than accepting them? These were revolutionary ideas to us. They contradicted our training, but they were right." The discussion turned to specific memories. Veterans shared stories of Shermans pulling T-34s from mud, of quick repairs that got them back into combat, of hatches that opened when needed, of radios that actually worked, of surviving hits that should have killed them. Former Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Konovalov, whose T-34 had been pulled from mud by a Sherman at Kursk, spoke. "I was taught that Soviet tanks were superior to all others. I believed it. Then an American Sherman saved my life by pulling my T-34 from mud that would have trapped us until German artillery killed us. I learned that day that superiority isn't just about armor and guns. It's about the whole system, including helping each other survive." A younger Russian in the audience, a tank officer in the modern Russian army, asked, "What lessons should we learn from this?" Former Lieutenant Loza answered, "Learn that your way isn't the only way. Learn that crew survivability isn't weakness, it's strength. Learn that reliability matters as much as firepower. Learn that comfort isn't luxury, it's combat effectiveness." The Americans understood these things in 1942. We learned them through blood in 1943 to 1945. Modern tank designers shouldn't need to learn them the hard way. The ceremony concluded with both Russian and American veterans standing before a restored Sherman M4A2 at the Kubinka Tank Museum. The tank had been recovered from a battlefield in Belarus, restored, and painted in the markings of the 233rd Tank Brigade. Former Lieutenant Loza placed his hand on the Sherman's hull. "This machine saved Soviet lives. It taught us that different didn't mean inferior. It showed us that keeping crews alive was good doctrine, not soft thinking." The T-34 won glory. The Sherman won gratitude. Both helped defeat fascism. But only one brought as many of us home as possible. An Orthodox priest blessed the tank. American and Russian veterans stood together. Former allies reunited. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the one that kills enemies most efficiently, but the one that keeps friends alive most reliably. The Sherman's service in Soviet hands left a permanent mark on Russian tank design philosophy, though this influence took decades to fully manifest. Soviet tank design continued emphasizing offensive firepower and armor over crew comfort through the Cold War. The T-54, T-62, 72 all followed the cramped, uncomfortable high-casualty pattern of the T-34. But gradually, lessons from the Sherman experience filtered through. The T-80 introduced more ergonomic controls. The T-90 included better crew accommodations. Modern Russian tank design increasingly acknowledges that crew survivability affects combat effectiveness. The Russian military today studies the Lend-Lease experience, including the Sherman service. Modern Russian military journals have published articles analyzing why Sherman-equipped units showed better sustained combat effectiveness than pure T-34 units. In the West, the Sherman Soviet service proved something important. The tank's design philosophy worked even in conditions far harsher than American designers had imagined. If the Sherman could keep Soviet tankers alive on the Eastern Front, the most brutal theater of the war, then its engineering principles were sound. Shermans provided to USSR via Lend-Lease. Total 4,102 M4A2 Shermans delivered. Operational losses, all causes, approximately 8,000 including earlier models. Crew casualties in Sherman units, approximately 25,000. Crew casualty rate per tank lost, 3.1. Comparative T-34 statistics. Total T-34/76 produced approximately 35,000. Operational losses, approximately 44,000. Crew casualties, approximately 180,000. Crew casualty rate per tank lost, 4.1. Sherman performance metrics in Soviet service. Average operational readiness, 75%. Average time to repair after damage, 8 hours. Crew survival rate when tank knocked out, 62%. Average crew service before rotation, 14 months. Comparative T-34 performance. Average operational readiness, 55%. Average time to repair after damage, 18 hours. Crew survival rate when tank knocked out, 45%. Average crew service before rotation, 7 months. Soviet commander assessments, post-war surveys. Commanders rating Sherman as excellent or good, 89%. Commanders preferring Sherman for sustained operations, 76%. Commanders acknowledging Sherman's superior crew survivability, 94%. The numbers told a story Soviet propaganda had tried to hide. The American toy had been a lifesaver. The story of the Sherman in Soviet service is ultimately about the collision of two philosophies. One that accepted crew casualties as necessary, and one that designed systems to prevent them. Soviet doctrine in 1943 assumed tanks were expendable and crews were replaceable. The T-34 embodied this philosophy perfectly, cheap to build, deadly in combat, and indifferent to crew survival. It was designed for a war where quantity mattered more than quality, where losses were acceptable costs of victory. American doctrine assumed something different, that experienced crews were force multipliers, that bringing crews home alive meant those crews could fight again tomorrow. That reliability mattered as much as firepower. That crew comfort wasn't luxury, it was combat effectiveness. The Sherman embodied this philosophy. Every design decision, the spring-loaded hatches, the turret basket, the auxiliary generator, the excellent vision, the smooth controls, assumed that keeping the crew alive and effective mattered. Soviet tankers initially hated these features because they contradicted everything they'd been taught. Comfort meant weakness. Crew survivability was soft thinking. Real tankers accepted suffering. Then they fought at Kursk. They got stuck in mud and were pulled out by Shermans. They were hit and survived when T-34 crews died. They fought for hours without exhaustion while T-34 crews collapsed. They coordinated operations with radios while T-34 crews fought blind. They learned that Soviet doctrine wasn't the only way, that American thinking had merit, that keeping crews alive made units more effective, not weaker. Lieutenant Dmitri Loza climbed into a Sherman in July 1943 and laughed at its comfort and features. He climbed out in May 1945 in Berlin, alive, having commanded the same crew through 2 years of the war's most brutal fighting. His crew survived because the Americans who designed the Sherman believed their lives mattered. Thousands of other Soviet tankers came home because they fought in Shermans, in a tank designed by people who thought crew survival was worth engineering effort. The Sherman pulled the Red Army out of the mud at Kursk, literally and figuratively. It showed Soviet tankers that different didn't mean inferior. That comfort enhanced combat effectiveness. That reliability won battles. That bringing crews home alive was good doctrine. Soviet crews thought the Sherman was a toy in July 1943. By May 1945, they knew it was a teacher, one that taught lessons about tank design, crew survivability, and military philosophy that Soviet doctrine had ignored. The Sherman wasn't superior to the T-34 in armor or firepower. It was superior in something more fundamental. It was designed by people who believed the crews operating it deserved to survive. That philosophy, more than any technical specification, was what pulled Soviet tankers out of the mud at Kursk and brought them home alive at war's end. The lesson remains relevant. In warfare, keeping your soldiers alive isn't soft thinking. It's the hardest, most practical thinking of all. Soviet crews learned that lesson the hard way. One mud-stuck T-34 pulled free by a Sherman, one survived hit, one crew brought home alive at a time. They had mocked it as a toy. It saved their lives, and that made all the difference.